Oh, welcome, Darin, to our interview today. So we're here with Darin Ingels, author of the Lyme Solution, a 5-part plan to fight the inflammatory autoimmune response and beat Lyme disease. So that's a very long title. Actually, very interestingly, I saw in your bio you're a fellow member of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. I was really excited to see that.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, it seems like not too many doctors have caught on with that yet. So tell me about basically your life, your work experience, your experience with Lyme disease, and how you got to write this book.
Well, I came to write the book because I got Lyme disease myself. I was infected back in 2002, about 3 weeks before I was due to open my practice. I went through very classic Lyme disease with headache, joint pain, fever, chills, numbness and tingling. I had a big bullseye rash on the back of my leg. So I had very classic textbook Lyme disease. And I went on traditional treatment of 21 days of doxycycline. And after 4 days of treatment, I felt perfectly fine. But I had just opened my practice. So, when you open your business here, I was the doctor, the bookkeeper, the receptionist, and I was working, 10, 12-hour days. So after about 8 months of doing that, I started to get symptoms again. And in retrospect, I can see, I wasn't sleeping very well, wasn't eating as well as I should have. And, all these lifestyle factors that go into keeping our immune system happy and healthy. So I started to relapse and I went back on antibiotics and it didn't do anything. So I changed antibiotics and it didn't do anything. And I continued for about 8 or 9 months of changing antibiotic protocols, but it was actually getting worse. My gut was a wreck. I was losing weight. I just felt horrible. So I was fortunate to find a doctor in New York City named Dr. Zhang. He's a Chinese medical doctor and acupuncturist in New York City. Mm-hmm. And I had actually had a few patients that had been treated by him that had Lyme disease. And he treated me, and he uses a lot of Chinese herbal medicine and acupuncture. And he really pulled me out of the weeds and got me starting to feel well. Of course, I'm a naturopathic doctor by training, so it's really kind of ironic that, I wasn't really doing a lot of the things that I advise my patients to do. Mm-hmm. So I just started taking stock of my life again and, eating better and trying to sleep more and do all the things I needed to do. And it took about 3 years, but I eventually got to a point where, I got rid of, my Lyme symptoms.
Great. I mean, that's a good hope for people that have had it for much more than 3 years, right? So there's a lot of people out there that have it for a long time.
Yeah, it's not uncommon that people have it for months to years. And, we could probably have a long discussion on why that happens. But I was fortunate that I did find it early. But, even for people that may have had it for a longer period of time, there's still hope. There's still a chance that you can reverse it and treat it. I've seen people that have had very serious Lyme disease, and as far as we can tell, have had it for years, that are able to overcome it. But it's very difficult. It's very challenging, and I appreciate what everyone with Lyme disease goes through, having been through it myself. I just know that there's a lot of things that are cofactors in getting your immune system healthy, and doing all the right things you need to do to really get over Lyme.
Mm-hmm. Great. So just for the listeners that may not be aware of it, what do you think happened when the antibiotics didn't work? How, from your perspective, what's the difference between maybe the antibiotics and why is your approach a natural approach?
Well, I think my own experience, what was happening is the antibiotics, being on them for so long was really starting to destroy my gut microbiome. We've got so much research coming out now about how important our gut bacteria are to maintaining not just our immune system, but, how our body, works metabolically, how we feel, our mood, our weight, all these things are really tied into our gut. So I think what was happening is that my gut was starting to break down, that started affecting all these other processes. So what I learned from my own experience, and then now having treated, thousands of Lyme patients, is that that's a good short-term solution. For someone that has acute Lyme disease, I think antibiotics are very appropriate. But for someone who's had it for months to years, I don't find, and the research corroborates this, that it really is very effective at helping people get over Lyme disease. And I think what happens is over the course that you've had Lyme, you get that initial infection, but beyond that, it really kind of transforms into an autoimmune disease. We actually have some good research demonstrating that Lyme actually triggers an autoimmune process where it starts attacking different proteins in your brain. And I think that's sort of the difference between what we see in acute Lyme disease, where people are kind of, acutely ill, where they've got fever and chills and sweating and things like that, versus chronic Lyme disease, where we start to see more neurological symptoms, memory loss, cognitive impairment, numbness, tingling. People say that they feel clumsy. I think a lot of these neurological symptoms are probably tied in the fact that the immune system in that autoimmune process is actually interfering with neurological function. So, no matter where someone is in the process, I think, it's a rare circumstance where someone's at that point where they really can't be treated. But, obviously the earlier you start treatment, the better chance you have of recovery.
Yeah. So this is very interesting. You're the first person I'm hearing from that there's an autoimmune component involved. I was thinking so far that the brain effects came from toxins and from, the immune system responding to the, to the LPS and to those kind of things. So the autoimmune is new to me. Do you think it's straightly from the Lyme disease and co-infections, or does it have to do with the GI and, leaky gut in addition to that?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I think, Lyme becomes a catalyst. I know for myself, I had some gut issues going into Lyme disease. So I think I was probably already predisposed. And I've seen other patients that have had similar circumstances. So, the gut certainly sets the stage. But when you get exposed to Lyme, there's a concept in immunology called molecular mimicry. And what that means is that there's a molecule on the organism that's very similar to a molecule in your own tissue. And it could be your brain, it could be your joints, it could be your muscles. So a lot of these symptoms, again, we see in chronic Lyme are probably a function, again, of the immune system trying to get rid of the Lyme and accidentally affecting our own tissue. But on top of that, you talk about LPS, this lipopolysaccharide that a lot of bacteria have in their cell wall. It's a very potent, immunogenic molecule. It really stimulates the immune system. So I'm sure that's a contributing factor as well. But independent of LPS, we do know that Lyme has this capacity to trigger autoimmunity. What makes it confusing, though, is that it's not autoimmune in the way that we think of lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. So a lot of the markers that we would normally look for in blood work typically are negative in Lyme patients. But symptomatically, they share a lot of similarities with autoimmune disease. In fact, I could argue that a lot of autoimmune disease, even traditional autoimmune disease, probably has Lyme or some of these co-infections as an underlying trigger. Even if you've been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, if you talk to your rheumatologist and ask them, well, why do I have RA? They're going to shrug their shoulders because they don't really know. So I think it's possible in some cases that, Lyme disease can be a cause for a lot of these autoimmune things that we see in people.
Wow, that's intriguing. And that actually makes me think about the blood-brain barrier. Basically, normally you wouldn't assume that the spirochetes get into the brain, right? Unless the blood-brain barrier is maybe compromised.
Yeah, when they've done post-mortem studies on people who've had Lyme disease, they can find Borrelia in the brain. But it's not the literal bacteria, burrowing through the brain and destroying the brain that way. There is a level of inflammation that definitely occurs with what they call neuroborreliosis or Lyme in the brain. But as far as we know, that process may be just as much, the immune system reacting to the organism than the organism itself. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we don't do brain biopsies on living people. So, it's hard to measure that directly, but I think it's more the inflammation that we see in the brain is probably secondary to the immune response versus, the organism directly penetrating the blood-brain barrier and affecting it that way. Okay. But, you kind of mentioned earlier about, the gut, does a leaky gut equal a leaky brain? The gut-brain connection is so tight. I think it's very possible that people who have leaky gut, to a certain degree, probably also do have a leaky brain. Now, in having a leaky brain, if we want to think of it that way for simplicity, does that also allow for other molecules to penetrate it and perpetuate that inflammatory cycle? I think it's very probable. I haven't read anything specifically that addresses that, but I think it makes a lot of biochemical sense.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So let's go on. Maybe so you're having a natural approach and you seem to be successful with it, which I am very intrigued about because I know some Lyme doctors still have mixes between antibiotics and natural. Some maybe herbalists use only natural approaches, but you as a naturopathic doctor, I'm very interested in your naturopathic approach. And can you describe that a little bit for us?
Sure. I want to say that, Lyme is extremely complex, and I'm trying to put it in an easy to understand format, but it is very complex. But, what I've talked about in my book in the approach is really kind of a 5-step process. And the first step of that, as we sort of mentioned earlier, is about the gut. If the gut's not working well, it's hard for your immune system to function well. We know from the research that up to 80% of our immune function comes from the gut. So again, if you're constipated, get chronic diarrhea, chronic gas, chronic bloating, SIBO, any of these type of gastrointestinal problems can lead to further immune issues. So we really want to take stock of what's going on with the gut, make sure that people are digesting their food, eliminating properly, that all of that mechanism is working well. And I talk a lot about specific nutrients that people can use to help facilitate better bowel habits. So depending on where the problem is, we can use things like probiotics. We can use things like glutamine. It's very nutritive to the large intestine. We can use digestive enzymes if people aren't breaking their food down well. So I go into a lot more of the specifics in the books, but there are a lot of natural things we can do to help make sure that the gut is working the way that we want. So that's really, step one of the process. Step two of the process is really about diet. I've worked with a lot of different diets with Lyme patients, and after having tried a lot of them myself and with other people, what I've come to find is what that works best for most Lyme patients is what we call an alkaline diet. And an alkaline diet means is that you're eating foods that really help modulate your cellular pH. So you're not going to change your blood pH. Your blood pH is very tightly regulated. Too high or too low and you're dead. So that doesn't change. What we're really talking about is making sure that each cell in your body has the appropriate pH so that everything within that cell, all the enzymes, all the influx in and out of different nutrients and so forth is working well. And with the exception of the stomach, the bladder, and for women, the vaginal area that's very acidic, the rest of your body is actually very alkaline. But what we're exposed to on a day-to-day basis, and this is where my environmental medicine background kind of comes into play, all these different environmental factors like chemicals and toxic metals and things of that nature tend to make our body very acidic. The end product of acid is inflammation. So a lot of the inflammatory processes that we see in Lyme patients, at least to a certain degree, may be attributed to sort of how acidic the body is. So by eating a diet that's more alkaline, we're trying to shift that pH in the right direction that keeps it in a somewhat alkaline state. And again, I go into much more specifics in the book, but the Cliff Notes version is that you're basically eating a mostly vegetarian diet. We try to limit animal proteins, so things like meat, and fish, and eggs to about less than 20% of your total intake. Mm-hmm. And then we eliminate any very acid-forming foods completely. So that's junk food, processed food, it's dairy products, it's coffee. My patients hate me when I tell them to take them off coffee because most of them are so tired they need that coffee for the kick. But I know for myself that when I was sort of in the acute stages of Lyme, I used to drink coffee. I love coffee, but I would take a sip of coffee and my neuropathy would flare within minutes. Mm-hmm. And I would stop it, would get better. I'd start, it would get worse. So I saw that very clear correlation. And again, I've seen that in other patients. So the concept that, well, maybe just a little's okay. For some people, it's not. So I recommend that while people are starting this process, that they really be diligent with their diet. And as they feel better, they'll have more latitude to cheat every now and then. But initially, I think as tight as they can keep it, we see results faster. So that's sort of the second step. The third step is really going after active infection. And again, I think antibiotics are very effective in the early stages, but when people get to the chronic stage, and even in some cases of early stage Lyme, I've used herbs. I think herbs are very potent. They work very well. But herbs as a whole, they function in a different way than an antibiotic, which is an isolated compound designed to kind of do one thing. Particularly with Chinese herbs, because they're compounded as formulas, they're not single herbs. Mm-hmm. They're addressing multiple processes in the body. So when I saw Dr. Zhang and he started me on his protocol, well, not only were the herbs going after killing the Lyme, They were reducing inflammation. They were helping improve my circulation. They were help boosting my immune system. They were breaking up these things called immune complexes that get kind of caught in the bloodstream and stimulates your immune system. So it was really addressing kind of the totality of everything that Lyme was doing to me. And so I like the concept of herbs because, again, often we're sort of killing more than two birds with one stone. Although they're very effective at going after the organism, they're also very effective at reducing the damage that Lyme can cause to your body. Another herbal protocol I use is from Dr. Cowden. Lee Cowden was a cardiologist in Dallas, and he developed a series of tinctures. Most of these herbs come from the Amazon, Peru, down in that part of South America. These herbs have actually been studied by a woman up here at the University of New Haven, Dr. Eva Sappi, and she herself had Lyme disease, so she started studying all these things. Well, these are in vitro studies, so take it for what it is. But in vitro, she found that the herbs were actually more effective than doxycycline, which is the common, recommendation for Lyme in the acute phases. The other thing is that doxycycline only seems to work when Lyme is in a specific phase of its life cycle, where she found with the herbs, it actually addresses Lyme in all the phases of its life cycle. So again, you could argue, at least in vitro, that the herbs are actually more effective than the antibiotics.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different herbal protocols out there. If you go on the internet, you'll read about a bunch of them. And I've seen a lot of them work. So what I recommend is that if you start with one, if you're not getting the desired result, switch to something else. Sometimes one protocol just happens to work better than another for reasons I don't completely understand. But Dr. Zhang's protocol and Dr. Cowden's protocol are probably the two that I use the most because I get the most clinical benefit with the least potential side effects.
Yeah. I'm studying with David Winston, and so his protocols are all individualized. So that's very interesting, highly individualized. So we're thinking about how to do that in the future for a broader market. So if somebody has an acute infection and they know, oh my goodness, I've been bitten by a tick, they may or may not have the bull's rash. So you did mention several times maybe the best line of defense is doxycycline when you're just acutely bitten, or do you have an herbal protocol too that people could use safely with an acute infection right away, or to prevent it actually?
Well, it really kind of depends on the person, and it depends on how acutely they've been infected or potentially infected. So my recommendation is that they get some treatment. For most people, if we know that they've been bitten recently, I do recommend antibiotics. And depending on the age of the person, either doxycycline or amoxicillin, if they're not allergic to penicillin, are options. I think the shortfall is that the conventional recommendation is 10 to 21 days. And I think most of us who treat a lot of Lyme patients would agree that it's too short. It's just not enough. Most bacteria in your body replicate every 20 minutes. Lyme disease can replicate up to every 16 days. So it's a very slow growing organism. And a lot of the antibiotics that we use, again, only work when the organism is replicating. So if it's dormant, the antibiotics really don't do anything, particularly doxycycline. So this is where, again, I think herbs can be effective. Now, I've used herbs and antibiotics with patients in acute Lyme disease. I have other patients that really don't want antibiotics and we just use herbs. And I'm completely comfortable with that. I have complete faith in herbs. Again, I think they're highly effective. They're very potent. So it really comes down to kind of personal preference. And, I think what you, the Lyme patient, how you feel about it, and, the Lyme practitioner, what their comfort level is. But again, I've had experience of treating people who've been acutely infected. We don't know if they have Lyme yet because sometimes it can take a while for a test to be positive. But I think the earlier that people get treatment, the better chance they have of getting rid of it. So, being someone who practices in Connecticut, where we're the home of Lyme, if someone pulls a tick off, until we get the tick test back, until we get their test back, we treat them until proven otherwise. So I'd rather err on the side of caution than run the risk of ending up with Lyme disease and then having chronic problems later.
Makes sense. Yeah. What about pulsing? Do you pulse with herbs or do you only pulse with antibiotics?
I've really only pulsed with antibiotics. I've really not found the need to pulse with herbs. The concept of pulsing with antibiotics, part of it is also to help prevent, the bacteria from becoming resistant to the drug, and changing it up a little bit, plus to take some of that pressure off the gut. But with herbs, because they're far more gentle, even though they're very potent against Lyme, strangely, I don't get a lot of gut die-off that we get with antibiotics.
Hmm.
So maybe because it's a plant material, it affects your normal gut flora in a different way.
Yeah.
Again, I don't really know why that is, but I rarely get people who get gastrointestinal problems on an herbal protocol. So I think people can use it very safely.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's the beauty of herbs, that they are actually selective antibiotics. If you go into the plant biology, they have to also nurture probiotics at their roots, right? So their own antibiotics are selective, which is very interesting. But a lot of healthcare practitioners, and this is kind of interesting, even for me, it's relatively new, don't know much about how to treat Lyme with homeopathics, and why some people, I've talked to several people for whom homeopathic was the breakthrough in their treatment. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, for myself, homeopathy was really what got me, completely symptom free. So I had been taking herbs and I got about 85, 90% better, but I still had some residual neuropathy. And I was treated by a homeopath from Belgium who
Hmm.
I studied with.
Hmm.
And she gave me a remedy. And actually, within a matter of weeks after taking that, I really became completely symptom free. So I've used homeopathy in various forms. I'm trained as a classical homeopath where generally we give one remedy one time. That's the way that Hahnemann did it. But I've had people who've done various forms of homeopathy. I think for people who understand homeopathy, realize that it's really trying to get to the core of the problem. It really does address the whole person. It's not a one symptom based kind of therapy. So, homeopathy for a lot of people is, again, designed to, stimulate your body to heal on its own. That's the whole concept that Hahnemann proposed.
Hmm.
But the challenge can be is that everyone who has Lyme has different symptoms. So it's not like one remedy treats all Lyme patients. For example, there's a remedy called Lidum that's indicated when you get a puncture wound. Well, because you get Lyme from a tick bite, which is a puncture of the skin, a lot of people will just take Lidum thinking that that's going to be their right remedy. In most cases of Lyme, Lidum is not the right remedy. So, you know, people need to understand that homeopathy is very individualized, and if you're going to go down that route, I would highly recommend that you work with a trained professional homeopath who really understands the remedies, understands how to manage you, knows when you need to change remedies if the remedy's not working. There's also a tendency in homeopathy to be impatient. And if you don't feel results within a few days, it's like, oh, this remedy didn't work. We need to move on to something else. Well, everyone's body heals in a different time, and sometimes it just takes a little longer for the remedy to do what we want it to do. So you'll find that homeopaths are generally very patient people, and you kind of have to be to make sure that you get the right remedy. But in addition to classic homeopathy, I've also been using a therapy called LDI, or low dose immunotherapy, which is really a form of homeopathy where we take a Lyme organism. It's killed, it's irradiated, so it can't cause any kind of infection, and we dilute it out homeopathically, and then we mix it with an enzyme called beta glucuronidase. And what we find is that enzyme can help stimulate the body against whatever it's mixed with. So in homeopathy, this is actually called isopathy. It's actually using the same thing that actually caused the problem. And we've had several patients now we've been treating over the last 4 or 5 years with this therapy, that even when they've done several other therapies that failed, this has sometimes been the breakthrough therapy. So that highly diluted amount of dead substance for some people can again kind of turn off that reaction that seems to be making their symptoms worse.
So does it stimulate their body to fight these barricades stronger, or does it um, train the immune system to accept the maybe the inflammatory particles more, or how does it work? Do you know?
Well, at lower doses, what we think it does is it modulates these cells in your body called Treg cells, T regulatory cells. And your Treg cells are really kind of the conductors of the immune system. So what we think it's doing is that it's actually affecting these cells that starts turning off that autoimmune reaction. So it's not stimulating your body to fight anything as far as we can tell. It's actually doing sort of the opposite. It's turning off that autoimmune reaction. People need to understand that there's two really facets of your immune system. There's that one part that's designed to directly go out and fight infection, and there's that other part that makes antibodies that just alert the immune system that there's a problem. Antibiotics by themselves don't really actually do anything. They just are a signaling mechanism for other parts of your immune function. So you can have a perfectly functioning first part that will go after the infection and fight it, but you can have a very dysfunctional second part that starts making these inappropriate antibodies. And again, that's really sort of the definition of autoimmunity. So we don't want to affect that first part. We want you to be able to fight infection appropriately, but we want to turn off that inappropriate reaction, again, that's sort of gone haywire. And again, I think that's what triggers a lot of these chronic Lyme symptoms.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. LDI is very interesting. You can also use that for allergies and those kind of things, other autoimmune diseases, right?
Yeah, well, LDI came out of another thing called LDA, which is low dose allergy therapy. And Dr. Ty Vincent, who developed LDI, he had been doing LDA as a way of treating, mold and pollen and dust and cat and dog and food and all these different kinds of run-of-the-mill allergies. And that was actually developed by a doctor out of the UK back in the 1960s. So LDA has actually been around for quite a long time. But Dr. Vincent realized that the mechanism by which the immune system was making allergy was pretty similar to how the immune system was responding to different bacteria and viruses. So you can imagine if your immune system looks at something like Epstein-Barr virus or strep or Lyme, and instead of treating it as a pathogen, it starts treating it as an allergen, that's a bit of a problem. You haven't made the right immune response to get rid of the bug, but now you've made this inappropriate immune response that's interacting with your own tissue. So I thought it was very clever, and clinically, again, we've had some pretty good results with it. But yeah, the whole purpose of it is really just to down-regulate and turn off that inappropriate immune reaction.
That's awesome. That's really good to hear. So there's a lot of options. In the book, you describe an immune boosting diet. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Or?
Well, the immune boosting diet really is the alkaline diet. Again, by optimizing your cells and getting in that alkaline state, plus healing the gut, we're now setting the stage that allows your immune system to work the way that we want it to do. So it's really just kind of following that alkaline diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So I only have maybe 2-3 questions left. One of them is what's the part that plays toxicity in there? Environmental medicine, the toxins we're exposed to every day. What do you think? How does it play into the Lyme disease phenomenon?
Well, I think the biggest role is that we accumulate various toxins over the course of our life, and we know that the average American gets exposed to over 80,000 chemicals a year. Most of that bioaccumulates in our fat tissue. But over the course of time, between that toxic exposure, the things that we use on our skin, the things we use around the house to clean our bathtub and our sink, the things we have in our garage, the things we spray on our lawn, all these chemicals have an additive effect. And many of them are known toxins. So in addition to the damage they do to our tissue, they potentially also undermine the immune system, compromising its ability. So again, it sort of becomes this synergistic problem where you've got already an overload of chemicals and toxins in our body. Now we've got this persistent infection and or autoimmune condition. Again, all of that's the perfect storm to start just feeling really terrible. And clinically, I think it can be very difficult to distinguish, what's Lyme versus what's other types of toxic exposure. I think the greatest example is mold. We know that mold or mycotoxicity is probably the closest thing that looks like Lyme disease.
Mm-hmm.
If someone's in a water-damaged home or office, you can experience symptoms that feel like Lyme. You can get headaches, you can get pain, you can get fatigue, you can get flu-like symptoms. And it has nothing to do with Lyme. I mean, it's what that mycotoxin is doing to your body. So, part of our workup when we're dealing with chronic Lyme patients is looking at all these other environmental factors that might be playing a role in their health. That's sort of the fourth part of what I talk about in the plan is, go through your home, go through your environment, look at all the things that you're being exposed to. And if there's something that's a potential toxin, get rid of it. Clean up the house, clean up your environment. And mold is something, again, particularly here in the Northeast, where we've got old buildings and lots of moisture, you're setting the stage for having a mold issue. So I recommend, even if you don't think you have mold in your home, get it tested, find out. Because if you've been chronically sick and you've been treating Lyme and you still don't feel well, perhaps there's something else going on that's not Lyme related. and even for people who might have an occupation where they've got toxic exposure. So, dentists and nail technicians and mechanics, people who just have daily exposure to various chemicals, again, that can make it difficult for your body to really heal and get well. So it's always a good idea, again, to kind of just go through, make a list of everything that you have exposure to, or just start wandering through your cupboard and garage, and anything that potentially could be toxic, put in a box and go get rid of it, and then replace it with something more natural that's less likely to bother you. But the environment, I think, every year gets a little bit worse. So as much as we can do to control it, just gives you every opportunity to feel well.
Yeah, I recommend the Environmental Working Group a lot for people to look those things up.
Environmental Working Group's great. And for people who don't know this, ewg.org is a great place that you can go and you can get information about, safe cosmetics and laundry detergent and soap and makeup and, anything like that. And there's another website called, I think it's safecosmetics.org, or maybe it's .com. But they also have a list of personal care products that can be safe. And I list it as a resource in the book. But you've got plenty of great online information that you can look up what you've been using and find out if it's potentially problematic. So it's worth, the hour or two to go through your list of products and just make sure, again, you're not accidentally being exposed to something that could be harmful to you.
Yeah. And we've recently had a big discussion amongst our groups about electromagnetic sensitivity and electromagnetic radiation. Do you look at that too?
Yeah, again, I think there's some great emerging research on how EMFs affect people. One of the things I talk about in my book is about using a machine called PEMF, or pulsed electromagnetic frequency. Actually, Germany's done a ton of research on this device, and we get exposed to so many negative EMFs. This is actually a positive EMF. This is a frequency that resonates at the same as your own cells. So it's designed to help stimulate your own cells to repair itself, regrow, and it certainly improves circulation. So I think, as part of our environmental control, we're looking at, where does the router sit in your house? Do you have a lot of Wi-Fi in your bedroom? Do you have other types of appliances that might emit a very high EMF frequency? Do you happen to live next to a high tension wire? Again, there are some people who become very susceptible and sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies. And of course, nowadays, it's hard to go anywhere without getting bombarded by something. We found out in our area up here that our local cable company was actually, when you would order your cable box, was actually setting it to be a public Wi-Fi spot. So people had no idea that their own cable box was actually a hotspot for the neighborhood. And it has to generate a higher output to be able to do that. So people were getting a higher EMF exposure than they even knew about. Yeah. So tell people at night, turn your router off, turn your Wi-Fi off. You don't need it. It just helps reduce your exposure. And there's a lot of great products out there on the market that can help protect you against electromagnetic frequencies.
Yeah, we have other interviews about that, but I hadn't heard that they put hotspots in the houses. That's crazy. The PMF, are you talking about something like the beamer where it's a randomized field, or are you talking about the fields that are pulsed and you can actually feel them?
As far as I know, all PMF devices, the ones I've used, you can't actually feel any of it. Okay. But the beamer is a type of PEMF device. The difference, I think, between the beamer and some of the other ones, the beamer is designed for home use. It's 8 minutes twice a day. And it's very limited on what you can do with it. The settings are kind of the same. Mm-hmm. The device that we carry in our office actually has 200 different programs that we can set to be, again, very individualized to the patient. So there is a lot of variance between company and company that makes these devices. Again, the concept of what it's doing is the same. Yeah. But the way in which you do it and the programs that come on it are a little bit different.
Interesting. I had one more question. It's almost more a personal question, but there's a lot of information out there on biofilms, and a lot of people come to the office and say, I want to bust my biofilms. But we know that the probiotics also have biofilms, right? So what's your take on the biofilm question?
Well, biofilm is actually a normal process that a bacteria has. It's a way that bacteria survive in the body. Most bacteria in your body do make biofilm. And for people who don't know what biofilm is, when you wake up in the morning, you get that gunky stuff on your teeth. That's biofilm. It just so happens that Lyme is exceptionally good at making biofilm. So it's one of these things where your normal bacteria make a little bit of biofilm. Lyme probably makes a lot of biofilm. But because Lyme makes that biofilm, it's kind of like a shield, so that as your immune system and herbs or antibiotics are trying to get directly to the organism, that biofilm makes it harder for that to happen. So I still think it's a good idea that people use some type of biofilm treatment to help break it up so that it's just easier for your Lyme treatment to work. But that doesn't come without potential problems that you're disrupting the normal biofilm that your bacteria would make. We don't really have a biofilm replacer, but I think giving probiotics can probably help mitigate that to a certain degree. But it's a great question, and the honest answer is we don't know the truth of that because we can't easily measure biofilm in people actively. All the research that's done on it is not something that's commercially available, so we can't constantly take a sample of blood, put it under a microscope, and see what your biofilm load is today. Right. So we sort of treat presumptively based on what we know from the research, but it's part of my protocol is to use some sort of enzyme product to help break up biofilm, and clinically, I think it helps.
Yeah, you just mentioned the biggest problem I have with medicine is that we don't have instant feedback. I don't know exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, well.
Okay, so I'm almost out of questions. Is there something that you feel we forgot or should still talk about, or you want to mention? Get out to
I think the last part of what I talk about in my plan is really about just lifestyle factors that people need to be mindful of, and this involves things like sleep and stress management and exercise. And again, it's the one part that I think we as practitioners sometimes overlook because we get so caught up in the biochemistry of what's happening with people. But so many people I see with Lyme, once they had Lyme, they don't sleep well. Well, when you get into that deep sleep, that's when your brain repairs itself. That's when your body gets a chance to heal. So if people aren't getting enough hours of sleep or aren't getting a good quality sleep, we're really missing that opportunity to heal. And so I'm a big fan of really doing whatever you've got to do to get your body to get that deep restorative sleep. And again, I talk about it in my book, but there's a lot of natural things you can do to help facilitate deeper sleep, better quality of sleep without necessarily using medication. And stress management, being sick is stressful. It's a stress on you. It's a stress on your spouse. It's a stress on your family, your friends. And I know how it is. I kind of felt this way after a while. My friends didn't want to hear about it. My family didn't want to hear about it. And yet you still feel not well. So I think it's a good idea that people start reaching out to other members of the Lyme community, a therapist, a group support, whatever it is that you need to be able to connect with other people, stay involved in the world, stay engaged with people. It's very easy to isolate yourself when you don't feel well. And I think it's important that, I think as humans by nature need to be around other people, but be around people that lift you up and support you and not people who kind of tear you down. And then, just exercise, movement, body is designed to move. And I know how it is, again, when you feel terrible, the last thing you want to do is do any kind of exercise. And I certainly don't recommend, going out and running a marathon, but I think there's a lot of very gentle things that you can do even when you don't feel well. You can sit on the floor and you can stretch. You can, walk if that's possible. I've had patients who are in wheelchairs because of Lyme, and we try and come up with creative ways to, move their upper body. So, there's a lot of different ways it can come. I give some suggestions in the book, but, you can certainly work with your healthcare provider and come up with ways to get your blood moving, because that's what's going to bring oxygen and nutrients to your tissue. It's part of that healing process. So, if you've been dealing with chronic Lyme, I think, the other things we talk about that are more related to killing the bug and breaking up biofilm and getting you metabolically in good shape is really important. But there's this other psycho-emotional aspect that we really need to pay attention to, because it does become a big part of people with Lyme. It becomes a big part of their life. So it's another thing that we can do to kind of help them mentally and emotionally start to heal.
Yeah, and we know that the immune system, the neuroendocrine system, basically influences, so stress and emotional stress influences the immune system, right? So,
absolutely.
Yeah. You brought up one more thought in my brain, and that is mitochondrial support. Do you have any specifics on supporting energy for people that, even want to do a little walk or a little stretching, but have barely? One of my clients keeps saying, I call her and I'm like, how do you do? She's like, oh, I wake up in the morning and I want to call Uber to bring me to the kitchen.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. Well, it's interesting. Again, there's some research that Lyme disease itself damages your mitochondria. And that can be compounded, again, if you've been on long-term antibiotics. The antibiotics actually damage your mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
So the treatment itself can be a cause, particularly of persistent fatigue. So the Lyme's causing fatigue, probably partially because of mitochondrial damage. The antibiotics make it worse. So there's a whole mito cocktail, which is just a nutrient cocktail that we use for a lot of people. And my combination is coenzyme Q10. I like acetyl L-carnitine, and then vitamin B6 and magnesium. There's actually several other nutrients that you can use as well to help support mitochondria, but that's a very basic foundational thing that people can take, and it really seems to help, kick the mitochondria up a little bit and improve energy.
Great. Have you found different forms of CoQ10 to work better than others?
I've used various forms. I tend to use ubiquinol versus ubiquinone. Again, I think there's some evidence that ubiquinol is maybe a little bit better absorbed. But the one thing about CoQ10 that I think people miss the point with Lyme is they tend to underdose it. For a lot of other conditions, we'll use, 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams. Sometimes in cardiovascular disease, we might use 200 or 300 milligrams. Well, in Lyme patients, it's not uncommon to use 600, 700, 800 milligrams of CoQ10. Sometimes the mitochondria are damaged so badly, you need doses that high to really make an impact. Again, fortunately, side effects from CoQ10 are pretty nominal. I rarely see any problems other than a few digestive issues. But don't be shy about using higher doses of CoQ10 to try and get a good clinical result.
I think that's a great tidbit. So for people that have tried CoQ10 and it doesn't get better, it could be the dose.
Yeah. Again, most people I see when they come in and they've been recommended CoQ10 by another practitioner, rarely do I see anybody who goes higher than 300 milligrams. But again, clinically, I found that higher doses seem to work better.
Interesting. Great. Yeah. Wow. I think that was very interesting. Do you have a good last word or anything you want to say?
Well, my final word always is that, if you've been dealing with chronic Lyme, don't give up, keep at it. And of course, every year, I go to different conferences and we find that there's other new therapies that are emerging. There's always something that can be done. And I've talked to so many people that feel like they've exhausted their resources and like, there's nothing else that can be done. I've already tried everything. Well, that's probably not likely. There are still other things. So, keep at it, talk to your healthcare provider, try and find creative ways to get over it. But again, I think it's important to really take stock of, what are you eating? What are you doing in your life? Are you really taking care of yourself? Are you really doing all those things you need to do to get well? And if you are, great, then start looking at some of these other strategies to help overcome Lyme. But, my message is that of hope, and that I was able to get over Lyme disease. I think it's possible for other people. Again, it just takes a lot of diligence and making sure that you're working with a provider that really helps support you in that way.
Right. So keep it low, fight it slow, don't give up.
Exactly.
Perfect. Great. It's nice talking to you. And so I really liked your book when I read it, so I just want to recommend that. I'll probably post a cover after this interview, and so people, you can get it on Amazon starting tomorrow, correct?
Yep. The Lyme Solution comes out tomorrow on all the major book retailers, so we'd love for people to pick up a copy, and otherwise they can go to my website. Got a lot of information about Lyme disease, the book, so we'd love to help, support people in that way.
Okay, what's your website?
It's dariningelsnd.com. So it's DARININGELS, N as in Nancy, D.com.
Okay, I'll post that in a written form too. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jan.